The old stagecoach bounced and rattled along the dusty road, making Margaret Sullivan grip her worn leather bag tighter with each bump. She pressed her face against the small window, watching the endless Texas plains roll by under the scorching summer sun. After 3 days of traveling, her back ached and her dress was covered in a fine layer of dust, but she didn't mind. Every mile took her further from the life she was leaving behind. The other passengers had gotten off at various stops along the way. Now she sat alone with her thoughts and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. In her bag, carefully folded, between her few belongings, was the letter that had changed everything. Position available for qualified schoolteacher in Cedar Falls, Texas. Room and board provided. Immediate start required. She had written back the same day, not even waiting to think it through. Back in Missouri, the whispers had become too much to bear. 28 years old and never married, the church ladies would shake their heads whenever she walked by. Poor Margaret, they would say. Not quite quiet enough. Such a shame. She's educated and all, but what good does that do when no man wants her? The young girls in town would giggle behind their hands, making bets about whether she would die an old maid. Her own mother had stopped asking about suitors years ago. Instead, she would just sigh deeply whenever the topic of marriage came up in conversation. "Maybe you're too particular, dear," she had said just last month. "Maybe you should lower your standards a bit." The words had stung more than any of the town gossip. So when the teaching position opened up in Cedar Falls, Margaret had seen it as a gift from heaven. A chance to start fresh where nobody knew her story, where nobody would count the years and shake their heads in pity. The stagecoach began to slow and the driver called out, "Cedar Falls coming up." Margaret's heart started beating faster. She smoothed down her brown hair and tried to brush the dust off her plain blue dress. First impressions mattered, especially for a woman in her position. Cedar Falls looked like every other frontier town she had passed through, but somehow it felt different because it was going to be home. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with wooden buildings that looked like they had been thrown together quickly. A general store, a saloon, a church with a tall steeple, and various other shops created the heart of the small community. People stopped what they were doing to watch the stagecoach arrive. It was probably the most exciting thing that had happened all week. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped down from the coach, her legs shaky after the long journey. The driver handed down her trunk and touched his hat politely. "Good luck to you, miss," he said with a kind smile. "Cedar Falls is a good town. You'll do fine here." Margaret thanked him and looked around, wondering where exactly she was supposed to go. The letter had mentioned that she should ask for directions to the boarding house where she would be staying. A group of women had gathered near the general store, talking quietly among themselves while stealing glances in her direction. One of them, a plump woman with graying hair, approached her with a welcoming smile. "You must be our new school teacher. I'm Mrs. Peterson. Welcome to Cedar Falls." "Thank you," Margaret replied, grateful for the friendly greeting. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. I'm looking for the boarding house where I'll be staying." "Oh, that would be Mrs. Henderson's place, just down the street there." Mrs. Peterson pointed to a 2-story wooden building with a wide front porch. "She's been getting your room ready all week. We're so excited to have a real teacher again. The last one left 6 months ago to get married." As they walked toward the boarding house, Mrs. Peterson kept up a steady stream of chatter about the town, the people, and what Margaret could expect. But Margaret noticed how the other women watched her, their eyes taking in everything from her simple dress to her unmarked ring finger. She had hoped to escape the judgment, but it seemed to follow her wherever she went. Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a kindly widow in her 60s, who showed Margaret to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Meals are served downstairs," she explained. "Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. Lunch you'll have to manage on your own, but there's always something in the kitchen if you need it." That evening at dinner, Margaret met the other boarders. There was Mr. Wilson, an elderly man who worked at the bank, and the young clerk from the general store. The conversation was polite but cautious. Everyone was curious about the new teacher, but nobody wanted to seem too nosy. Later, as Margaret unpacked her few belongings in her room, she could hear voices drifting up from the porch below. The words weren't clear, but the tone was familiar. She had heard it so many times before, that mixture of pity and judgment that people used when talking about unmarried women of a certain age. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked out the small window at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow she would meet the children she would be teaching. Tomorrow she would start building a new life in this dusty little town. But tonight, she felt the weight of all those years of disappointment settling on her shoulders like an old, familiar shawl. In Missouri, she had been the spinster schoolteacher that people tolerated but never really accepted. Here in Cedar Falls, she was starting over as simply the new teacher. But how long would it take before she became just another object of pity? She pulled out a small mirror from her bag and looked at her reflection. Plain brown hair pulled back in a simple style. Brown eyes that were neither particularly large nor small. A face that was pleasant enough, but nothing special. No wonder, she whispered to herself, echoing the thoughts that had haunted her for years. Margaret carefully folded her traveling dress and hung it in the small wardrobe. Tomorrow she would wear her best dress, the green one that brought out her eyes a little. She would stand straight and smile confidently. She would be the best teacher Cedar Falls had ever had. Maybe if she couldn't be the kind of woman men wanted to marry, she could at least be the kind of woman people respected. But as she lay in the narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new town, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was just postponing the inevitable. Sooner or later, the people of Cedar Falls would see her for what she really was, a woman nobody wanted. And the whispers would start all over again. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's arrival in Cedar Falls, and she was beginning to find her rhythm. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with wooden benches and a large slate board at the front. 23 children of various ages attended, from little 6-year-old Lucy to teenage Tom, who was almost as tall as Margaret herself. The children had welcomed her with the easy acceptance that only young people possess. They didn't care that she was unmarried or that her dresses were plain. They only cared that she made learning interesting with stories and games, and that she never raised her voice in anger like their previous teacher had. But the adults were a different matter. Margaret had quickly learned the social structure of the small town. The married women ruled the social circles, planning church events and organizing community gatherings. The unmarried women her age were few, mostly young, girls waiting for the right man to come along. At 28, Margaret found herself in an awkward position, too old to fit in with the young women but not quite accepted by the married ones. She had settled into a routine of teaching during the day and spending her evenings alone, reading, by lamplight in her small room. It was a quiet life, but at least it was peaceful. No one bothered her with well-meaning advice about finding a husband or suggestions that maybe she should be less particular. That peace was interrupted on a Tuesday morning when she arrived at the schoolhouse to find the front steps crumbling. Several of the stones had shifted, creating a dangerous gap that could easily trip one of the children. She spent a few minutes trying to push them back into place, but it was clear that the problem was bigger than she could handle alone. "Those steps have been causing trouble for months," said a voice behind her. Margaret turned to see a man she didn't recognize standing near the schoolhouse gate. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by early gray at the temples. His clothes were simple but well-made, and his hands showed the calluses of someone who worked with them every day. She guessed he was somewhere in his 30s. "Are you the new teacher?" he asked, stepping closer to examine the damaged steps. "Yes. I'm Margaret Sullivan." She brushed the dust off her hands, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "James McKenna," he replied with a slight nod. "I own the ranch outside town. Also do stonework when folks need it." He knelt down and ran his hands along the broken stones, testing their stability. "These weren't set properly to begin with. The whole foundation is shifting." Margaret watched as he examined the damage with the expertise of someone who understood how things were built. "Can it be fixed?" she asked. "Oh, sure, but it's not a quick job. Needs to be torn out and rebuilt from the foundation up. Probably take a few days." He stood and dusted off his hands. "I can start tomorrow if the town council approves it." "The children shouldn't have to risk getting hurt every day," Margaret said firmly. "I'll speak to them this afternoon." James looked at her with something that might have been approval. Most folks would wait for someone else to handle it. Good for you for taking charge. The comment surprised Margaret. She was used to people, either ignoring her opinions or treating her ideas as if they were cute, but not really important. This man spoke to her as if her thoughts actually mattered. The next morning, James arrived early with a wagon full of tools and stones. Margaret was already at the schoolhouse, having come early to move some of the benches away from the front of the building. Without being asked, James helped her carry the heavier pieces. "You didn't have to come so early," he said as they worked together. "I like to be prepared," Margaret replied. "Besides, I wanted to see how this kind of work is done. I've always been curious about building things." As the days passed, Margaret found herself looking forward to James's arrival each morning. Unlike most men in town who either ignored her completely or spoke to her with the polite distance reserved, for spinsters, James talked to her like a regular person. He answered her questions about stonework without acting like she was bothering him. He even asked for her opinion on things like which stones looked best together. "Why did you become a teacher?" he asked one afternoon as he carefully fitted a stone into place. "I love learning," Margaret said simply. "And I'm good at it. It seemed like the obvious choice." She paused, then added more quietly, "It's one of the few respectable jobs available to women like me." "Women like you?" James looked up from his work. Margaret felt heat creep up her neck. She hadn't meant to say that last part out loud. "Unmarried. Women," she clarified, trying to keep her voice steady. James was quiet for a moment, then went back to his work. "Seems to me that being unmarried just means you haven't found the right person yet," he said casually. "Nothing wrong with that." The simple acceptance in his voice made Margaret's throat tight. She had grown so used to people treating her unmarried state as either a tragedy or a character flaw that his matter-of-fact response caught her off guard. As the week progressed, James began staying after his work was finished to help Margaret prepare the schoolroom for the next day. He would move heavy items or reach high shelves without being asked. In return, Margaret would bring him coffee and sometimes share stories about the children's progress. One evening, as dark clouds gathered overhead threatening rain, James offered to walk her back to the boarding house. The wind was picking up, and Margaret gratefully accepted his escort. They were halfway there when the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time they reached Mrs. Henderson's front porch, it was pouring. They stood under the covered porch watching the rain turn the dusty street into a muddy river. "Thank you for walking with me," Margaret said, turning to face him. In the dim light from the porch lamp, his face looked younger somehow. "My pleasure," James replied. "I enjoy talking with you. You see things differently than most people." Something in his tone made Margaret look at him more closely. There was a warmth in his eyes that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced before. For a moment, standing there in the rain-scented evening air, she felt like maybe she wasn't as invisible as she had always believed. But then reality crashed back in. Men like James McKenna didn't look at women like her that way. He was just being kind to the lonely schoolteacher. She was probably reading too much into simple politeness. "Well, good night," she said quickly, reaching for the door handle. "Margaret," James said softly, causing her to pause. "Would you like to go for a walk on Sunday afternoon? After church, I mean. If the weather's nice." Margaret's heart began beating faster. Was he asking what she thought he was asking? Yes, I think I'd like that," she managed to say. James smiled, and for the first time in her life, Margaret felt like maybe she was the kind of woman someone might actually want to spend time with. The feeling was both thrilling and terrifying. She lay in bed that night, listening to the rain pattering against her window. Margaret tried not to let herself hope too much. But despite all her efforts to stay realistic, she couldn't stop herself from imagining what it might be like to have someone look forward to spending time with her, what it might be like to matter to someone. Sunday afternoon arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that made the heat bearable. Margaret had changed her dress 3 times before settling on her blue one with the small white flowers. It wasn't fancy, but it was her newest, and the color brought out her eyes. She had even let her hair down a bit softer than usual, though she told herself it was just because of the humidity. James was waiting for her after church, hat in hand, looking unusually nervous. He had clearly made an effort, too. His shirt was pressed and his hair was neatly combed. Several people noticed them walking together, and Margaret caught Mrs. Peterson watching with raised eyebrows. "Where would you like to walk?" James asked, as they stepped off the church porch. "Anywhere is fine," Margaret replied, then felt foolish for not having an opinion. "I mean, you know the area better than I do." They walked toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open grassland and scattered oak trees. The conversation started awkwardly, both of them seeming to search for the right things to say. But gradually, as they walked further from town, they began to relax. James told her about his ranch, how he had bought the land 5 years ago and built it up from nothing. Margaret shared stories about some of the funnier things her students had said or done. They found themselves laughing together, and Margaret realized she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed so easily with anyone. They had been walking for about an hour when they came to a small creek lined with cottonwood trees. The spot was peaceful and shady with flat rocks that made perfect seats. James suggested they rest for a while, and Margaret gratefully accepted. "This is beautiful," she said, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "Do you come here often?" "Sometimes, when I need to think," James replied. "It's quiet, peaceful." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I don't usually bring people here." Something in his voice made Margaret look at him. "Why did you bring me?" James picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water. "Because I like talking to you. Really talking, I mean, not just polite conversation about the weather." He glanced at her, then looked away again. "You're different from other people in town." "Different how?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "You think about things. You ask questions. You're not content to just accept everything the way it's always been done." He turned to face her fully. "You're interesting, Margaret. Most people aren't." The compliment made Margaret's heart flutter, but it also made her suspicious. "You don't have to be kind to me, James. I know what I am." "What do you mean?" The words came spilling out before Margaret could stop them. All the hurt and disappointment of 28 years of being overlooked, of being the woman men were friendly with but never seriously considered. "I mean, I know I'm not the kind of woman men marry. I've accepted that. You don't have to pretend otherwise just to be nice." James was quiet for so long that Margaret began to regret her outburst. She had probably made him uncomfortable. Now, he would make polite excuses and their friendship would become awkward. "Who told you that?" he asked finally, his voice serious. "No one had to tell me. I have eyes. I can see how people look at me, how they talk about me." Margaret picked at the fabric of her dress, unable to meet his gaze. 28 years old and never even been courted properly. Never had a man show real interest. That tells a story, doesn't it? "It tells me the men you've known were fools." Margaret laughed bitterly. "That's kind of you to say, but we both know it's not true. If I were the marrying kind, someone would have married me by now." James was quiet again, studying her face with an intensity that made her nervous. "What if I told you I was thinking about building a house?" he said suddenly. The change of subject confused her. "A house? I thought you already had one on your ranch." "I have a cabin, but I mean a real house. Something permanent, something beautiful." He stood up and began pacing along the creek bank. "I've been thinking about it for years, but I never had a good enough reason to start. Never had anyone to build it for." Margaret watched him pace, wondering where this conversation was going. "I'm sure you'll find someone someday. The right woman will come along." James stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "What if she already has?" The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe properly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to build that house for you. I want to build you a home that's worthy of who you are. A place where you'll never have to doubt your worth again." Margaret stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. That's not funny, James." "I'm not trying to be funny." He sat back down beside her, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. I'm trying to tell you that those people who made you feel unwanted were blind. You're worth building something permanent for, something that will last. Tears started in Margaret's eyes. You don't know me well enough to say that. I know enough. I know you care about your students enough to fight for proper school steps. I know you ask thoughtful questions and listen to the answers. I know you work harder than anyone expects you to because you take pride in doing things right. He reached out and gently touched her hand. I know you think you're not worth choosing, but you're wrong. James. Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. Let me build you a house, Margaret. Let me show you what you're worth. The tears spilled over then, running down Margaret's cheeks as 28 years of feeling unwanted crashed into this moment of being chosen. Why? She managed to ask. Because the first time I saw you trying to fix those school steps by yourself, I thought, there's a woman who doesn't wait for someone else to solve her problems. Because when you talk about your students, your whole face lights up. Because you make me want to build something beautiful that will last forever. He squeezed her hand gently. Because no man has ever claimed you? Then I will. Margaret cried then, really cried, for the first time since she was a child. All the years of feeling like she wasn't good enough. All the lonely nights wondering what was wrong with her. All the well-meaning comments about being too particular or too educated. It all came pouring out. James didn't try to stop her tears or tell her everything would be fine. He just sat beside her and held her hand while she grieved for all the years she had spent believing she wasn't worth loving. When the tears finally stopped, Margaret felt emptied out but somehow lighter. I don't know how to believe you, she said honestly. That's okay, James replied. I'll just have to prove it. Starting with that house. It's going to be built from stone. Beautiful stone that will stand for 100 years. Just like the kind of love you deserve. As they walked back toward town in the golden afternoon light, Margaret felt something shifting inside her chest. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen something worth fighting for, worth building for. She didn't know how to trust it yet, but she wanted to try. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about herself all along. The next few weeks passed like a dream Margaret wasn't sure she wanted to wake up from. True to his word, James had begun work on the stone house. He had chosen a spot on his ranch about 2 miles from town, on a small rise that would catch the morning sun and evening breezes. From there you could see for miles across the Texas plains. Every day after school, Margaret would walk out to the building site. At first she just watched, fascinated by the way James selected each stone carefully, turning it this way and that until he found the perfect fit. But gradually he began teaching her about the work. See how this stone has a natural curve to it, he would say, holding up a piece of limestone. It wants to be part of an arch. You don't force stone to do what it doesn't want to do. You work with what it gives you. Margaret learned to mix mortar, her teacher's hands becoming rough and stained from the work. She learned to spot which stones would work together and which ones would never fit no matter how hard you tried. Most importantly, she learned that building something meant taking your time and getting each step right. Why stone? She asked one afternoon as they worked on laying the foundation. Wood would be faster. James paused in his work and looked out across the plains. Wood burns. Wood rots. Stone lasts. He glanced at her meaningfully. Some things are worth building to last forever. The conversations they had while working were different from any Margaret had ever experienced. James asked her opinion on everything, where the windows should go, how large the kitchen should be, whether they needed a separate room for books. A library? Margaret had asked when he first mentioned it. In a house? Why not? You love books. You should have a proper place for them. He had already sketched out plans showing built-in shelves along one wall and a comfortable reading chair by the window. Every house should have a library. As autumn arrived and the walls grew higher, Margaret found herself believing more each day that this was really happening. The people in town had certainly noticed. Mrs. Peterson and the other church ladies would ask pointed questions about her friendship with James McKenna. The questions made Margaret nervous, but James seemed unbothered by the attention. "Let them talk," he said. When Margaret worried about what people might say, "They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough." But Margaret's growing happiness was threatened in October when the stagecoach brought a new arrival to Cedar Falls. Catherine Walsh was everything Margaret had always wished she could be. Young, beautiful, with golden hair and blue eyes that sparkled when she laughed. She was also recently widowed and looking for a fresh start, which made her both respectable and available. Catherine had come to stay with her cousin while she decided what to do with her life. Within days of her arrival, she had charmed half the town. The men tipped their hats more eagerly when she passed. The women invited her to tea and asked her advice on fashion. Even Margaret's students talked about the pretty lady they had seen at church. What made it worse was that Catherine seemed genuinely nice. She had introduced herself to Margaret after church, praising her work with the children and asking intelligent questions about teaching methods. There was nothing to dislike about her except the way men looked at her, the way Margaret had always dreamed someone might look at her. Margaret tried to push down the jealousy that rose in her chest whenever she saw Catherine's perfect smile or heard her musical laugh. She had no right to feel this way. James had made his choice. He was building her a house for heaven's sake. But the old fears were hard to silence. Those fears grew louder when Catherine began showing interest in James. She would find excuses to visit the general store when he was in town picking up supplies. She would ask him questions about his ranch and stonework, her eyes wide with admiration. She would compliment his craftsmanship and ask if she might see the house he was building sometime. "She's just being friendly," James told Margaret when she mentioned Catherine's interest. But Margaret noticed he didn't invite Catherine to see the house. Still, the doubts crept in. Margaret would catch herself comparing her plain brown hair to Catherine's golden curls, her simple dresses to Catherine's fashionable outfits. When she looked in the mirror, she saw all the reasons why a man might change his mind given a better option. The crisis came on a cold November afternoon when Margaret arrived at the building site to find Catherine already there. She was standing inside the partially completed house, her hands clasped behind her back as she looked around with obvious appreciation. "Margaret," Catherine called out when she saw her approaching. "I hope you don't mind. I was riding past and James offered to show me the house. It's absolutely beautiful." James looked uncomfortable and Margaret felt her stomach sink. "I should have asked first," he said quietly to Margaret. "She was asking so many questions and I thought." "It's fine," Margaret said, "though it wasn't. It's your house." "Actually," Catherine said with a bright smile, "James was just telling me it's going to be your house." "How exciting. You must be so thrilled." There was something in Catherine's tone that made Margaret look at her more closely. The smile was still there, but her eyes were calculating. Suddenly Margaret understood. Catherine wasn't just admiring the house. She was evaluating the competition. "Yes, well," Margaret said carefully, "nothing is final yet, of course." "Of course," Catherine agreed, her smile never wavering. After all, a man should be absolutely certain before making such a permanent commitment. "Don't you think, James?" James looked between the two women, clearly sensing the undercurrent but not understanding it. "I'm certain," he said firmly. But Margaret heard something else in Catherine's words, a challenge. The beautiful young widow wasn't just being friendly. She was making it clear that she was available and interested, and that Margaret shouldn't take James's attention for granted. That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. All her old insecurities came flooding back. Catherine was younger, prettier, more accomplished. She was the kind of woman men wrote poems about, the kind who got first choice of husbands. What if James realized he could have someone like that, instead of settling for plain Margaret Sullivan? By morning, Margaret had convinced herself that the kindest thing she could do was step aside before James had to make an awkward choice. She would tell him he was free to pursue Catherine if he wanted to. It would hurt, but at least she would keep her dignity. She walked to the building site that morning with her rehearsed speech ready, but when she arrived, James was alone, carefully, setting stones for what would become the fireplace in the main room. "You're early today," he said with a smile. "Come see this. I found the perfect stone for the mantelpiece." Margaret looked at the large flat stone he had positioned above the fireplace opening. It was beautiful, smooth gray granite with veins of darker stone running through it like rivers. "It's lovely," she said, then took a deep breath. "James, we need to talk." Something in her tone made him stop working and turn to face her fully. "What about?" "About Catherine Walsh. About this house. About us." The words came out in a rush. "I think maybe you should consider your options before you make any decisions you might regret." James was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "What are you really saying, Margaret?" "I'm saying you're a good man, and you deserve to be with someone who fits better. Someone younger and prettier and more—" She gestured helplessly. "More everything." James set down his tools and walked over to her. "Are you talking about Catherine?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "Margaret," James said gently, "do you think I'm building this house because I feel sorry for you?" The question caught her off guard. I don't know. Maybe?" James took her hands in, his calloused fingers gentle against her palms. "I'm not building this house out of pity. I'm building it because I love you." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it because I have to. I'm saying it because it's true." James's voice was steady and sure. "I love the way you think about things. I love how you fight for what's right even when it's hard. I love that you see beauty in simple things and that you make everything around you better just by caring about it." Tears started in Margaret's eyes again. "But Catherine is a lovely woman. But she's not you. She's not the woman I dream about. She's not the woman I want to build a life with." James squeezed her hands. "You are." Margaret looked around at the partially built house, at the careful stonework, the thoughtfully placed windows, the room that was going to be her library. This man had spent months building her a home with his own hands, stone by stone, because he loved her. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop and start believing in the life he was offering her. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling strange and wonderful in her mouth. James smiled and pulled her close, and for the first time in her life, Margaret felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it both the completion of the stone house and the biggest test of Margaret and James's relationship. The house stood like a fortress against the harsh Texas wind, its stone walls solid and true, its windows glowing warmly in the evening light. James had worked tirelessly through the fall to get it finished before the worst weather hit. Margaret had helped with the final touches, hanging curtains she had sewn herself, arranging the furniture. James had bought in the larger town 50 miles away and carefully placing her precious books on the shelves in the library room. Every corner of the house reflected their combined dreams and efforts. But as beautiful as the house was, Margaret couldn't fully enjoy it. Catherine Walsh had not given up her interest in James, and her pursuit had become more obvious and determined. She would appear whenever James was in town, always with some innocent excuse. She needed advice about her horse. She wanted to know about buying property. She had questions about ranching that only James could answer. The other townspeople had certainly noticed. Margaret overheard Mrs. Peterson and her friends discussing it after church one Sunday. "That Catherine is certainly persistent," one woman said. "Can you blame her?" Mrs. Peterson replied. "James McKenna is the best catch in 3 counties, and let's be honest, she's much more suitable for him than that school teacher." "Margaret's a nice enough woman," another voice added, "but Catherine is young and beautiful, and she knows how to manage a household properly. Some men need wives who can handle social obligations." Margaret had hurried away before she could hear any more, but the words echoed in her mind for days. Maybe the women were right. Maybe James deserved someone who could be a proper rancher's wife, someone who would fit naturally into the social circles that mattered. These doubts came to a head during the Christmas social at the church. Margaret had worn her best dress, the dark green one that brought out her eyes. but she still felt plain next to Catherine, who had appeared in a stunning blue silk dress that must have cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. All evening, Margaret watched as Catherine charmed everyone around her. She danced gracefully with every man who asked, laughed at their jokes, and somehow managed to make each person feel like they were the most important one in the room. When James asked Margaret to dance, she couldn't help but notice how many people watched them, probably comparing her awkward steps to Catherine's earlier grace. "You're quiet tonight," James observed as they moved through the simple country dance. "Just tired," Margaret replied, not wanting to voice her insecurities, "at the church social." But Catherine wasn't content to simply outshine Margaret socially. During a break in the dancing, she approached James directly while Margaret was helping serve refreshments. "James," Catherine said, her voice carrying just far enough for Margaret to hear, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding ranching advice. Perhaps you could show me around your property sometime. I'm seriously considering buying land in the area, and I value your opinion so much." James glanced toward Margaret, who was pretending to focus on arranging cookies on a plate. "I'm pretty busy these days, Catherine. Maybe you should talk to the land agent in town." "Oh, but you know the area so much better than he does," Catherine persisted, placing a gentle hand on James's arm. "I promise I won't take up too much of your time. Just an hour or two?" Margaret felt her heart sink as she watched the interaction. Catherine was everything a man like James should want. Beautiful, charming, socially accomplished. She would never embarrass him at town events or make people wonder what he saw in her. That night, after James had walked her back to the boarding house, Margaret made a decision that she thought was noble, but that came from a place of deep fear. "James," she said as they stood on Mrs. Henderson's front porch, "I think we need to talk honestly about our situation." James looked concerned. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I mean that I think you should be free to make the choice that's best for you, without feeling obligated to me because of the house or anything else." "Margaret, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Catherine Walsh, and about the fact that she's interested in you and you'd be foolish not to consider someone like her." The words hurt to say, but Margaret forced herself to continue. "She's young and beautiful, and accomplished. She's the kind of woman who would be an asset to a man in your position." James was quiet for so long that Margaret began to think he was actually considering her suggestion. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Are you telling me you don't want to marry me? I'm telling you that you shouldn't feel trapped into marrying me just because you started building a house. If you've realized you'd prefer someone else, I understand." "I see." James's tone had gone flat. "And you think Catherine Walsh would be a better choice for me?" Margaret's throat felt tight, but she nodded. "I think she would make you happier in the long run. I think she's more what you really want." James studied her face in the dim light from the porch lamp. "You really believe that?" "Yes," Margaret whispered, the lie burning her throat. "Then I guess we don't have anything more to discuss," James said quietly. He touched his hat politely. "Good night, Margaret." Margaret watched him walk away, his shoulders stiff with hurt and anger, and realized she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. But it was too late to call him back. Too late to explain that she had pushed him away because she loved him, not because she didn't. The next few weeks were the most miserable of Margaret's life. James didn't come to town as often, and when he did, he was polite but distant. Margaret heard through the town grapevine that Catherine had indeed visited his ranch, and that they had been seen talking together at the general store. Margaret threw herself into her teaching, staying late at the schoolhouse and volunteering for extra duties at church. She told herself she had done the right thing, that James would be happier with Catherine in the long run. But late at night, lying in her narrow bed, she grieved for the future she had thrown away. The crisis came to a head in February during a fierce winter storm. Margaret had stayed late at school, grading papers, and lost track of time. By the time she realized how bad the weather had gotten, the wind was howling and snow was falling so thick she could barely see across the street. She was struggling through the storm, her shawl whipping around her and her feet slipping on the icy ground when a strong hand grabbed her arm. "What the hell are you doing out in this weather?" James's voice was rough with concern and anger. "I was working late," Margaret shouted over the wind. "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten." Without another word, James swept her up in his arms and carried her through the storm. But instead of taking her to the boarding house, he headed toward his wagon. "Where are you taking me?" Margaret asked. "Somewhere we can talk without the whole town listening," James replied grimly. He drove through the storm to the stone house, which glowed like a beacon in the white wilderness. Once inside, he set her down by the fireplace and began building up the fire, while Margaret looked around at the home they had built together. "You'll freeze to death trying to get back to town in this weather," James said without looking at her. "You'll have to stay here until the storm passes." Margaret nodded, suddenly aware that they were alone together in the house where she had imagined living as his wife. "James, don't," he said sharply, turning to face her. "Don't say anything unless you're ready to tell me the truth." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want to know if you really believe Catherine Walsh would make me happier, or if you're just scared." The direct question caught Margaret off guard. Of course I believe it. She's perfect for you." "Perfect for me?" James laughed bitterly. "Do you know what happened when Catherine visited my ranch?" Margaret shook her head, afraid to hear. She spent the entire time talking about how the house could be improved, how it needed more fashionable furnishings, better decoration, larger rooms for entertaining. She suggested I tear down the library because it was a waste of space. James moved closer to Margaret. She couldn't understand why anyone would build a house around books. Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. "But she's so accomplished. She's accomplished at being ornamental. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not what I want." James reached out and touched Margaret's cheek gently. "I don't want someone who sees my house as a project to be improved. I want someone who helped me build it stone by stone because she understood what we were creating together. James, I built this house for you, Margaret. Not because I felt sorry for you, and not because I was settling for less than I deserved. I built it because you are everything I want. You're smart and kind and strong. You make everything around you better just by caring about it. You're the woman I choose, not because I have to, but because I want to." Margaret looked around at the stone walls, at the carefully placed windows, at the library room with its empty shelves waiting for her books. "I was so afraid you'd realize you could do better. Better than the woman who fought to get the school steps fixed because she cared more about her students' safety than her own convenience. Better than the woman who learned to lay stone just so she could share my work. Better than the woman who makes me want to build